Hi, this is Father James Serbia at St. Timothy Parish in Chantilly, Virginia, and welcome to Holiness for the Working Day podcast. Through homilies, talks, and classes, the aim of this podcast is to help listeners to understand and live their Catholic faith in practical ways in the middle of their everyday lives. Please click the like or subscribe button wherever you listen to podcasts and share this podcast with your family and friends. Thank you.
I was kneeling by an altar in the Umbrian countryside in Italy some years ago, and there was a cross, a crucifix there that was very realistic. Our Lord was lacerated everywhere. His eyes were made of glass so they would stare at you, and the artist was able to render such a likeness of love coming off of these eyes and a living crucifix right before the moment of death, that you couldn't help but have your soul stirred, your heart ripped from you for a moment. And kneeling just on the other side of me was a mother and her young daughter, probably 5 years old or so. And she was there looking up at the statue, and you could tell that she was starting to become, this little girl, very emotional. In her big, beautiful brown eyes, tears were starting to well up. Mamma, mamma, no è giusto, mamma. Perché è morto? Perché è morto, mamma? She was begging her mom to explain, Mommy, it's no fair. Why did he have to die? Why did he have to die, Mommy? You could see that her heart was being stirred in this childlike faith, and her question was a really good one. Why did he have to die? The Son of the living God should be able to simply snap his fingers and change reality. And yet he chose to die. And we can take it for granted. Perhaps we wear a crucifix around our neck, or we have them in every room of our home, or we see them regularly. And it becomes ornamentation. It becomes a piece of jewelry. It's so easy to forget it. And perhaps even in our prayer, it's easier at least, I can come to terms with the damage my own sin causes. It's easy enough to see it. I see its effects rippling through time in myself, in others. I can see how it affects my relationship with God and keeps me stagnant at times. But how can I really understand? How can each of us really understand why he died? And why he died like that, in the worst of pains? And in order to understand it, let's begin with intimacy. It's something that all of us long for. We work for it constantly, and when we don't have it, we are fearful and hungry. We, in effect, can say those words, I thirst. Because ultimately that's what he thirsts for, our intimacy. It's what the deepest thirst of our hearts and our souls long for, intimacy with him. And it's something that we want a lot of. So let's go back to the original intimacy between God and our first parents, Adam and Eve. In the scripture, it says that Adam and Eve walked and talked together with God. That's biblical language for an amazing friendship, deep intimacy. It wasn't the master-slave relationship that every other pagan god and pagan people had with their God. No, this was a different kind of relationship. Something that no one ever had with Zeus and Apollo. It was the deepest of intimacies. And then, of course, the original sin takes place. And what was that original sin? We see it echoed in today's reading. Betrayal. Ultimately, every sin, the original sin, most of all, is an act of betrayal. They betrayed God and were unfaithful to the relationship. And because of that, it ruptures the relationship. But here's the thing. When someone is betrayed by someone else, only the one who has been betrayed can forgive and can reconcile the betrayer. The betrayer can't do it. They can ask for it, but they can't do it themselves. They might be deeply sorry. They might be committed to never doing it again, but they need the one who's been betrayed to extend forgiveness. In effect, the offended party is the one that heals the breach. Think of infidelity in marriage. Marriage is a common image in the Old and New Testament. The wedding of the Lamb, the wedding between God and his people Israel, the marriage between God and his church. It's common. We hear it constantly. But in an infidelity in marriage, the offended spouse has to give up something in order to reconcile, in order to make reconciliation possible. They have to give up, in effect, a bit of themselves. They have to give up their justified hurt. They have to give up their anger. They have to die a bit to themselves by once again exposing their hearts to their unfaithful spouse. Because by exposing their heart to their unfaithful spouse, once again, they open themselves up to the possibility of more hurt. They make themselves vulnerable. They put their heart in their betrayer's hands again. It's difficult, profoundly difficult, and it requires a heroic selflessness, an abasement of self in a way, to give yourself again to the one who betrayed you. It's a sacrifice of part of yourself. And the worst betrayal, the worse a betrayal, the larger the rupture in the relationship, and the larger the sacrifice of the one who needs to repair it, the one who's been betrayed. And so at the fall of man and woman, the fall of the totality of humanity, there was the ultimate rupture, the ultimate betrayal. No longer were we friends with God. The betrayal of the Creator by the created. The betrayal of the source of life and love himself. And how can that be reconciled? How can that be brought back together into a relationship? Because that's what God hungers for us, a relationship. Not a master and a slave, a friendship. Well, the one betrayed has to be willing to make the ultimate act of self-denial. And the ultimate act of self-denial is to give your very self, to pour everything out, your entire life, so that you can repair the breach between the betrayer and the betrayed. And so God, like a faithful spouse, puts himself entirely into the hands of those who betrayed him and continue to betray him. It's God totally dying to himself and to the world in order to forgive and to reconcile. He's the faithful spouse who builds the bridge over the breach. God places himself in my hands. He places himself in your hands. He places himself in their hands, and he is totally vulnerable. He holds none of his power for himself. He doesn't hold it over our heads. He, in effect, says, "This is my body. This is my blood, which is given for you, my unfaithful spouse, who I love." And he knows that we're going to betray him again and again and again. And yet he does it anyway. Because that's what love looks like. But he does something even more than that. And this is something that we can live, that we can participate in. Because he takes in all of suffering. There's not an ounce of any of the potential of suffering ever in the cosmos that he doesn't take on himself in this act of the cross. And in doing it, he now gives suffering, the thing that scares us the most, that we fear the most, that we run from the most, that we try to cover up and hide the most. He gives it meaning. Jesus Christ did not come to take away suffering. He came to give it meaning. He came to give it a new dimension. And so he takes on the worst of sufferings, the physical suffering of crucifixion, arguably the worst of all physical suffering, and the scourging and the crowning. But more than that, beyond that even more, he takes on the fullness of emotional suffering. He takes on the betrayals and the mockery. He takes on the jokes and the indifference. And he takes on the fullness of spiritual suffering, that existential crisis, that fear that you and I fear, that maybe, just maybe, death is the final answer. He takes that on as well. And he strikes evil right at its root, where it has the power to create fear, and now suffering, the very act of suffering, the very place of suffering, becomes the place where hope is found. We can't find hope outside of the cross. That's why he says, if you wish to be my disciple, you must pick up your cross and follow me. If you wish to be my disciple, go to the place where hope will be, where faith will be, where love is found. That's Calvary. And what before was totally meaningless now has more meaning and purpose than anything else in the world. Suffering has been eternally linked to love, not disobedience and betrayal. Before it was the result and the fruit of disobedience and betrayal. Now it's the result of the greatest act of love. And it's linked to a love that creates instead of to sin that destroys. It's no longer meaningless. It's the most meaningful thing. And he doesn't just betray us. He doesn't just redeem us from betrayal. He doesn't just reconcile us. He redeems my suffering and your suffering as well, so that when we suffer, and we all do, we become co-redeemers with him. When we unite our individual suffering to the cross of Jesus, our suffering becomes the cross of Jesus, and it touches the lives of a hopeless world. It answers the fear that people experience. We live in a time now of fear, of hopelessness, of faithlessness, of lovelessness, where there is very little vulnerability, where there is very little intimacy. And suffering is the answer. Suffering is what brings about love. When I suffer, I share in the act of redemption of Jesus Christ. And so do you. In effect, our suffering becomes an invitation to the passion. Come. Do you wish you could be at the foot of the cross? Do you wish you could be on Calvary? You can. Whether it's a voluntary suffering that we take on, a penance, a fasting, or it's a suffering that just comes to us and we take it on with joy. It now becomes an invitation to love, and it becomes the wellspring of hope. It's where our thirst is quenched, at the well of hope. And with faith, I can lift up my own suffering. And he'll use it in the most mysterious ways. And it might be ways that we've never seen. Perhaps the suffering that we endure, whether it's a small suffering of the fasting and the abstinence that we do today on this Good Friday, or maybe it's something worse. Perhaps we're suffering with cancer. Perhaps we've been betrayed. Perhaps we've been rejected or accused or hated by somebody. That now becomes a place of love. And it might help someone sitting next to you. It might lead to the conversion of a sinner you've never met. It might lead to hope being given to someone who will suffer martyrdom today at the hands of the hostile, because it's happening today as it did on Calvary 2,000 years ago. And when we take that on, we can now feel the joy. We actually feel joy in suffering. And it's the craziest thing in the world. The world can't understand it. They'll think we're insane. We'll think we're nuts. Because we are. We're insane with love. We're crazy in love with him. Because only love will drive somebody to the cross. Only love will drive somebody to love. And through his death and rising from it, everything has changed. Everything that brought fear now can bring hope. That's why the Father sent his Son into forsakenness, into the morass of sin and death. Not because he wanted his Son to suffer, but because he wanted his son to go into the darkest place and bring hope. Because there is no pit so deep that God's love is not deeper. That was a phrase once said by a woman who survived the Shoah, the Holocaust, who later became a classical violinist and played concerts all over the world. And one day in an interview after a concert, they asked, "How did you keep hope when you were at Dachau, when your whole family was murdered in front of you?" And she said, "There is no hole so deep that God's love is not deeper." And that hope, I am sure, was what we saw in her eyes as she watched her family die. It was in the eyes of anyone that suffers. And that hope is what was in the eyes of that little girl in that Umbrian chapel as she once again cried out to her mom, "Mamma, mamma, no è giusto. Mamma, perché è morto? Perché è morto, mamma? Why did he have to die, mommy?" And I'll never forget, she looked at her child with only the eyes that a mother can have, the same eyes that looked into John's as Jesus surrendered his life. And she looked at her and said, "Perché ti ama così tanto?" Because he loves you that much. And her daughter smiled and placed her head on her mother's shoulder, and they cried. But the tears of sadness were now tears of joy, and so should ours be today.